In March of 1899, France's highest court ordered the army to surrender a file that had helped convict Captain Alfred Dreyfus. The 7 military judges had been allowed to read it. Dreyfus and his lawyer had not. By the time the order was issued, the file contained intercepted letters, copied fragments, disputed interpretations, and a forged paper made inside French intelligence after the original verdict. Dreyfus was still guilty in law. He was still confined on Devil's Island. One question drives the case. How did a prosecution survive after the evidence hidden from the defense began to collapse? The answer is not contained in one dramatic confession. It runs through a torn memorandum, a handwriting theory that treated mismatch as proof, an intelligence officer who found another suspect, a novelist who forced the dispute into court, and 2 reviews by the Court of Cassation. Each turn exposed a different reason the conviction endured. The most important evidence was not always the paper inside the file. Sometimes it was the decision to keep that paper beyond challenge. The court's order changed the direction of the case. Until then, secrecy had protected the accusation. Once the judges demanded the dossiers, secrecy itself became something the law could examine. Subscribe to Dark-Historium for more quiet evidence-led history. Paris, in 1894, was a city living beside the memory of defeat. France had lost a war to Prussia less than a quarter of a century earlier. The loss had brought down an empire, created a new German state, and taken Alsace and part of Lorraine from France. Military planning carried the pressure of that wound. Maps, artillery designs, mobilization schedules, and intelligence reports were not dry office papers. They were pieces of a future war that many officers believed would come. The army had rebuilt itself around discipline and professional honor. It was also crossed by political and religious suspicion. The French Republic was still contested by royalists and authoritarian nationalists. The officer corps contained men who regarded parliamentary government with contempt. Anti-Semitic newspapers described Jewish citizens as an alien force inside the nation, even when those citizens had chosen France at personal cost. The Panama financial scandal had given agitators fresh material. They treated the actions of individual Jewish financiers as proof against an entire people. Alfred Dreyfus had grown up in Mulhouse, in Alsace, in a Jewish family whose textile business had prospered. When Germany annexed the region, the family chose French nationality and moved its center of life west. For Alfred, military service offered a form of belonging that seemed exact and demanding. He entered the École Polytechnique, trained as an artillery officer, and continued through the War College. He was serious, mathematically minded, and sometimes reserved. None of those qualities made him unusual in a staff office. His religion did. By his middle 30s, Dreyfus had married Lucy Hadamard and had 2 young children, Pierre and Jean. He had reached the general staff as a trainee. The posting carried prestige, but it also rotated officers through different bureaus. Dreyfus could study systems without possessing every secret later attributed to him. This distinction would become important. The first investigation often treated possible access as actual knowledge, and actual knowledge as proof of betrayal. Across Paris, the German embassy maintained its own military contacts. French counterintelligence wanted to know what passed through the office of the German military attaché, Maximilian von Schwarzkoppen. A woman who cleaned inside the embassy, Marie Bastion, quietly collected papers from wastebaskets and passed them to the French intelligence section. Torn scraps could be reassembled. A discarded note might reveal an agent, a meeting, or the subject of a transfer. Late in September, or at the beginning of October, a torn memorandum reached the intelligence office. It became known simply as the bordereau, the memorandum. Its writer offered the German attaché information concerning several military matters. The list mentioned artillery and mobilization material, including a note about the hydraulic brake of a field gun. The handwriting was ordinary enough to invite comparison and distinctive enough to tempt certainty. The intelligence officers did not know who had written it. They began with an assumption about where the writer must work. The subjects appeared to point toward the general staff and toward an artillery officer. The search narrowed rapidly. Dreyfus was an artillery officer moving through staff departments. He also stood out in a way the investigators already understood through prejudice. He was the only Jewish officer then serving in that circle of the general staff. Suspicion did not begin as a complete case. It began as a shape into which later details were fitted. Colonel Jean Sandher, who led the intelligence section, believed the traitor had been found. Major Hubert Henry, an experienced officer in the section, shared the direction of the inquiry. Major Armand Dupaty de Clam, fascinated by handwriting and secret investigation, was brought in to manage the arrest. The Minister of War, General Auguste Mercier, accepted the developing accusation and staked his authority upon it. The handwriting was sent to experts, but the experts did not speak with one voice. Alfred Gobert, a specialist associated with the Bank of France, would not give the certainty the investigators wanted. He saw differences and refused a definitive identification. Another examiner, Alphonse Bertillon, did not merely see resemblance. He constructed a theory to explain the differences. Bertillon was known for systems of bodily measurement used in criminal identification. Handwriting was not his principal field. Faced with a memorandum that did not consistently match Dreyfus's hand, he proposed that Dreyfus had imitated his own writing while deliberately introducing variations. The accused, in this theory, had disguised his hand by producing a form of self-forgery. Any difference could therefore become evidence of cunning. Similarity pointed to the writer. Dissimilarity pointed to concealment. The idea made the hypothesis difficult to disprove because contradiction had been built into its defense. The handwriting reports had not solved the case. They had created a suspect. Investigators now tried to make the suspect confirm the paper. On the morning of the 15th of October, Dreyfus was summoned in civilian clothes to the Ministry of War. Dupaty met him in an office. Pretending that an injured hand prevented him from writing, the major dictated phrases drawn from the memorandum and watched the captain's pen. The room was arranged as a test. Other officers waited nearby. Dupaty believed he saw the hand tremble and the writing change. Dreyfus later remembered cold fingers and confusion. He had no reason to recognize the dictated phrases as a trap. When the test ended, Dupaty accused him of treason and offered him a revolver. The implication was plain. Suicide could spare the army a trial. Dreyfus refused. He declared that he was innocent and wanted to live in order to prove it. He was taken to the military prison at Cherche Midi and held without ordinary contact. Lucy was warned not to speak publicly. The children were told little. Investigators searched the family home and examined private papers. They found no payment from a foreign power, no unexplained fortune, no confession, and no secret document in his possession. The prosecution still had the bordereau, the handwriting theories, and a growing belief that a man trained in artillery could have supplied the listed material. The arrest leaked. Anti-Semitic newspapers did not wait for a trial. La Libre Parole, edited by Edouard Drumont, presented the accused captain's Jewish identity as the explanation for the alleged crime. The language was not incidental decoration around the case. It helped make guilt feel plausible before the evidence had been tested. Dreyfus became, in hostile print, less a particular officer than a symbol assembled from older suspicions. Mercier faced his own pressure. If the case collapsed, he could appear careless for having allowed the accusation to become public. If it succeeded, he would be the minister who had exposed a traitor. Political authority and investigative judgment began to reinforce each other. Each declaration of confidence made reconsideration more costly. By the time the trial opened, acquittal would no longer look like a quiet correction. It would look like the army retreating after a public accusation. The court-martial opened in December behind closed doors. The defense was led by Edgar Demange, a respected lawyer who believed a careful factual argument could persuade military judges. He challenged the handwriting case and the assumptions about access. Witnesses offered impressions of Dreyfus's manner, intellect, and supposed curiosity. The prosecution tried to turn personality into motive. Reserve became coldness. Attention to military subjects became suspicious appetite. The material proof remained weak. The bordereau was unsigned. Its contents did not fit Dreyfus as neatly as the accusation suggested. Experts disagreed. No witness had seen him deliver anything. No money trail connected him to the German embassy. Some information in the note was more readily available to officers outside the general staff. Yet the courtroom was not the only place where the case was being decided. The intelligence service held intercepted correspondence between foreign military attachés. Much of it could not be exposed without revealing French espionage methods. Some papers seemed, when isolated and interpreted aggressively, to refer to a traitor. One contained a contemptuous phrase about a person identified only by an initial. The identity was uncertain. The correspondence did not establish that the person was Dreyfus. A secret packet was assembled. Mercier later acknowledged authorizing the use of material outside the adversarial hearing. The exact path of every paper remained contested, but the essential act is clear. During the judge's deliberation, material not shown in court was placed before them. Demange could not examine it. Dreyfus could not explain it. No transcript preserved a defense response because no response had been permitted. The secrecy carried a double persuasion. It suggested that the visible case was only the surface of something larger, and it prevented the suggestion from being tested. A cautious judge might think that intelligence too sensitive for open court possessed a special authority. The very reason the defense could not see it could make it seem more serious. The visible case had not produced certainty. The hidden packet supplied the feeling of certainty without allowing anyone to test it. On the 22nd of December, the 7 officers of the court found Dreyfus guilty. The verdict was unanimous. He was sentenced to permanent deportation in a fortified enclosure and to military degradation. He continued to insist that he had not betrayed France. The ritual of degradation took place on the 5th of January in the courtyard of the École Militaire. Thousands gathered outside and around the grounds. Soldiers formed a square. A clerk read the sentence. An adjutant tore insignia and braid from Dreyfus's uniform and broke his sword. The condemned captain raised his voice above the ceremony. He declared his innocence and cried that France would live. The crowd answered with hatred. Some shouted for his death. Reporters described his face, his posture, and the condition of the broken sword, as though bodily behavior could settle the case. To supporters of the verdict, composure showed calculation. Emotion would have shown guilt. Once again, opposite observations could be made to support the same conclusion. Lucy was allowed to see him after the ceremony. Their conversations took place under restriction, yet both understood that the fight could not end with the sentence. Dreyfus asked her to seek the truth. He wrote to ministers and officials. He still believed that an error, once placed before honorable authorities, would be corrected. That faith was not naive in the simple sense. Dreyfus had built his life inside the institutions that now condemned him. The army had given order to his identity as a Frenchman from annexed Alsace. To accept that senior officers might knowingly sustain a false judgment required a different understanding from the one with which he entered prison. For a long time, he distinguished the honor of the army from the actions of particular men. The distinction helped him survive, even as those men used the same word against him. The ceremony settled Dreyfus's status in public. It did not settle who had written the bordereau. The government selected Devil's Island as the place of deportation. It lay off the coast of French Guiana among the Salvation Islands, a penal landscape of heat, rain, insects, surf, and isolation. The name later became inseparable from Dreyfus, though other prisoners were usually kept elsewhere in the colony. The authorities wanted him alone. He sailed from France in February and reached the islands in March. At first, he was held on another island, while a small enclosure was prepared. In April, he was moved to Devil's Island. His world contracted to a hut, a guarded path, a strip of sea, and the repeated presence of men forbidden to converse with him. The guards watched day and night. His letters passed through censors and traveled slowly. Books and supplies arrived irregularly. Weather entered the hut. Dampness affected paper, clothing, and health. He exercised by walking the same confined ground. He studied, wrote, and tried to maintain routines that could divide one day from another. Isolation did not mean silence inside his mind. He composed long letters to Lucy, often controlling his language because he knew others would read it. He asked about Pierre and Jean. He told his wife to preserve her courage and promised that truth would prevail. Despair appeared in the pressure of repetition, but so did discipline. He refused to make a false confession that might have improved his treatment or ended the public dispute. Lucy's letters gave him family life in fragments, a child's progress, a household detail. An expression of faith could cross the ocean after weeks of delay. The letters also concealed much. She could not safely tell him every turn in the campaign. Censors might withhold anything judged political. Dreyfus was therefore at once the center of the affair and one of the people least able to see its development. In France, Mathieu Dreyfus assumed the public burden. He had none of the state's investigative machinery. He had persistence, family resources, and the certainty that his brother was incapable of the crime. He visited lawyers, politicians, journalists, and anyone who might know how the bordereau had been found. Many refused him. Some listened politely and did nothing. Others warned that challenging a military judgment would only deepen the family's ruin. Mathieu needed more than belief. He needed a mechanism of error. The anarchist journalist Bernard Lazare helped provide the first sustained public argument. Lazare studied available reports and wrote a pamphlet showing contradictions in the handwriting evidence and the conduct of the trial. He also named the force that cautious defenders preferred to soften. Anti-Semitism had not proved the case, but it had prepared the country to accept an unsupported accusation against a Jewish officer. The pamphlet circulated in late 1896. It did not immediately reverse opinion. Its importance lay in changing the form of the challenge. The Dreyfus family was no longer asking only for mercy or trust. It was asking readers to compare claims, procedures, and documents. The first breach came from outside the army. The next would be made by the officer running its intelligence section. At almost the same moment, an officer inside the intelligence service was following a different piece of paper. Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picquart had taken charge of the statistical section after Sandhair became ill. Picquart was no natural ally of Dreyfus. He shared some of the prejudices of his class and had participated in the first case at its edges. What changed him was not affection. It was evidence that refused to stay aligned with the official verdict. The intelligence service received a torn telegram form, later called the Petit Bleu. It was addressed by the German military attaché to Major Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy. Esterhazy was a French infantry officer with financial troubles, grandiose habits, and access to military information. The message suggested an active connection between him and the same foreign office at the center of the bordereau inquiry. Picquart ordered discreet checks. He obtained examples of Esterhazy's handwriting. The resemblance to the bordereau was immediate and disturbing. The more closely Picquart examined the earlier case, the less secure it looked. The secret papers did not prove Dreyfus was the writer. Some did not concern him at all. The new suspect fit the handwriting and had a reason to seek money. This discovery created a simple investigative duty and a severe institutional problem. If Esterhazy had written the bordereau, then Dreyfus had been condemned for another man's act. The original investigators had failed. The use of the secret dossier would come under scrutiny. The army might be asked to recall a man already publicly degraded and sent across the ocean. Picquart reported what he had found. His superiors did not respond by reopening the conviction. General Charles Arthur Gons told him, in substance, that the two matters could be separated. A new traitor could be pursued without admitting that the old one had been wrongly condemned. Picquart understood that this was impossible. The bordereau was the legal foundation of the verdict. The identity of its writer could not be treated as an unrelated detail. He continued to press. The response was to move him away from the center of information. He was sent on inspection and then posted to Tunisia. Distance could be described as ordinary service while serving another purpose. Picquart was warned to remain silent. Before leaving, he had confided in his lawyer and friend, Louis Leblois. Leblois later spoke to Auguste Scheurer-Kestner, vice president of the Senate, and a figure whose Republican reputation gave the claim new weight. The secret was beginning to escape the chain of command, not through a dramatic theft, but through one person's decision that official channels had ceased to protect the truth. The intelligence office did not remain passive while Picquart was removed. The earlier packet of secret papers had always been weaker than its reputation. Now, with another officer tied to the German attaché, the weakness became dangerous. A document appeared that seemed to give Dreyfus a direct place in foreign correspondence. It was made from portions of 2 letters, joined so that a phrase about a person identified by an initial appeared to confirm the old accusation. The paper would become known as the Faux Henry. Hubert Henry had created it inside the service, entrusted with detecting forgery and treason. His act did not begin the miscarriage of justice. but it changed its moral structure. Before the forgery, defenders of the verdict could claim they were preserving a decision honestly reached from imperfect evidence. After the forgery, at least one officer was manufacturing support for a conclusion the evidence could no longer sustain. Forgery also transformed uncertainty into apparent confirmation. A reader who already believed Dreyfus guilty could look at the new paper and feel that doubt had been answered. The document did not have to survive a careful adversarial test. If it remained secret, it had to reassure the small circle that controlled the file. Henry's new paper appeared to close the doubt. Its physical construction would later open the entire file. Meanwhile, life on Devil's Island became harsher. In the summer of 1896, newspapers carried a false report that Dreyfus might have escaped. The colonial authorities reacted to a rumor as though it revealed a weakness in security. A double palisade rose around his hut and reduced his view. At night, guards fastened him to his bed for weeks. The iron restraint injured his ankles and made sleep more difficult. He had not attempted to escape. The punishment was preventive, imposed because an event invented in France could be imagined in Guyana. The episode showed how distance stripped him of control over even the reasons for his suffering. A paragraph in a newspaper could alter the physical conditions of his body before he knew the paragraph existed. His health declined. Fever, digestive illness, exhaustion, and the effects of confinement returned in cycles. Yet he kept records. He copied letters. He made calculations. He studied English and continued professional reading when books were allowed. These habits were not proof of innocence, but they were instruments of self-preservation. A man whose identity had been reduced to a verdict could still choose how to order a mourning. Lucy continued to write as wife, advocate, and guardian of the children. She brought petitions in her own name because the law allowed the spouse of a convicted person to request review under certain conditions. Public discussion often placed famous men around the affair, but her labor connected its private and legal worlds. She kept Alfred present as a husband and father, while asking institutions to consider him again as an accused person entitled to evidence. The children grew while their father remained almost motionless in time. Pierre was old enough to understand that his name drew attention. Jean knew her father through letters, photographs, and the emotional weather of adults. Dreyfus tried not to make them inherit despair. He told Lucy that his honor belonged to them as well as to him. Vindication was not an abstract decoration to be placed upon his career. It was the form in which he hoped to return to his family. Matthew's search acquired a new opening in November of 1896. A facsimile of the bordereau appeared in a newspaper. A stockbroker named Maurice Castro recognized the handwriting as that of a former client, Esther Hazy. Other specimens emerged. The family could now place a name beside the document. Esther Hazy's life made the lead more than a graphical curiosity. He was perpetually short of money. He wrote extravagant and bitter letters. He had moved through military postings without the promise once attached to Dreyfus's career. His correspondence showed both resentment toward France and a willingness to trade upon connections. None of this by itself proved he had written the bordereau, but the convergence was far stronger than the character impressions once used against Dreyfus. Mathieu arranged for handwriting comparisons and pursued Esterhazy openly. The suspect, alerted to the danger, presented himself as the victim of a Jewish conspiracy. He sought protection among officers and nationalist journalists. The case was beginning to produce a strange inversion. The man linked to the German attaché could claim the mantle of the army, while the officer transported for treason remained excluded from the evidence that might clear him. Führer Kästner moved cautiously. He had served France through political upheaval and did not want to make an accusation he could not sustain. He listened to Leblois, examined the handwriting, and spoke privately with senior officials. He hoped that the army would correct the matter from within. The hope repeated Dreyfus's own faith in honorable authority, but it met the same resistance. President Félix Faure and ministers feared the consequences of reopening the case. General Jean-Baptiste Biot, the war minister, could point to the confidence of his predecessors and to papers hidden from public inspection. Each new office holder inherited not only the evidence, but also the institutional cost of admitting what the evidence meant. Private appeals had reached the top of the state and stopped there. The evidence would move only when someone carried it into public view. Officials grouped the army's reputation, government stability, diplomatic secrecy, and public order under reason of state. No one needed to believe France would literally collapse if one captain received a new trial. The practical claim was that reopening the verdict threatened interests larger than the accused. With each ministry that defended the case, correction carried a higher institutional price. In November of 1897, Mathieu formally accused Esterhazy of writing the bordereau. The army could no longer keep the second suspect entirely outside legal form. An inquiry opened under General Georges de Pelliot. Picquart was recalled as a witness, but the inquiry turned suspicion toward him. The Petit Bleu was declared questionable. His handling of secret information was treated as misconduct. Esterhazy, meanwhile, enjoyed guidance from men who knew the contents of the intelligence file. The proceeding demonstrated how an institution can investigate a threat to its conclusion without truly investigating the conclusion. Questions concentrated on whether Picquart had exceeded his authority, whether documents had been altered by defenders of Dreyfus, and whether public agitation endangered the army. The central comparison between Esterhazy's hand and the bordereau remained present, but it was surrounded by narratives designed to reduce its force. Esterhazy demanded a court-martial, confident that a military tribunal would clear him. The trial opened in January of 1898. It was held behind closed doors for crucial testimony. Senior officers supported the original judgment. Picquart was challenged and humiliated. After a brief deliberation, Esterhazy was acquitted unanimously. Outside, admirers cheered him. The speed and certainty of the acquittal deepened the sense that ordinary channels had closed. If the army could examine the man whose handwriting resembled the central document and find no case, while punishing the officer who discovered him, then private appeals to authority had reached their limit. The military route had cleared the man linked to the handwriting. 2 mornings later, Émile Zola opened a different route. 2 days later, on the 13th of January, the newspaper L'Aura published an open letter by Émile Zola beneath a headline that became part of political language. Accuse named ministers, generals, handwriting experts, and courts. Zola charged that an innocent man had been condemned and that Esterhazy had been protected. He addressed the President of the Republic, but his practical audience was the public and the legal system. The article did not reveal every secret paper. Zola could not know all that later inquiries would uncover. Its power lay in converting a diffuse scandal into specific accusations, for which he could be sued. A libel prosecution would place officers on a witness stand and allow the defense to ask about the first trial. Zola was making himself a procedural doorway. The risk was real. He could be imprisoned and fined. His publisher could suffer with him. His reputation as one of France's leading novelists did not protect him from a court. Yet publicity had become a form of evidence preservation. Matters spoken in private offices vanished into denial. Matters argued before reporters could be compared, transcribed, and remembered. The Zola trial began in February. The courtroom was crowded and volatile. Lawyers tried to discuss Dreyfus, while judges repeatedly insisted that the legal question concerned defamation, not the captain's guilt. The limitation was formally correct and practically impossible. To decide whether Zola had defamed the court-martial, the tribunal had to approach the conduct he described. Picquart testified. He explained the petit bleu, the handwriting, and his discovery that the secret file did not establish Dreyfus's guilt. Generals contradicted him and invoked information they said could not be revealed. Hubert Henry confronted Picquart and declared on his honor that the intelligence officer had lied. The appeal to honor filled the space where documents could not be examined. The trial created scenes of public intensity, but its deepest conflict was quiet. One side asked that assertions from military rank be trusted because revealing their basis would harm the nation. The other asked whether rank could be permitted to make an untestable assertion decisive. The original secret dossier had carried that conflict into a locked room. The Zola trial exposed it without resolving it. Zola was convicted and received the maximum punishment of 1 year in prison and a large fine. A procedural error later overturned the verdict, and a new trial was ordered. Facing another conviction, he left for England. Exile kept him out of prison, but separated him from his home and work. The campaign for Dreyfus now had its own convicted defendant. Picquart also lost his freedom. The army removed him from service and pursued charges concerning the disclosure and handling of documents. He spent months in prison. The man who had found evidence against Esterhazy occupied a cell while Esterhazy traveled, gave interviews, and prepared eventually to leave France. The country divided into camps whose names entered the language. Dreyfusards argued for revision, legal rights, and the primacy of truth over institutional prestige. Anti-Dreyfusards defended the verdict. The army, nationalist unity, or openly anti-Semitic politics. The lines were never perfectly neat. Some socialists initially distrusted a campaign centered on a wealthy officer. Some conservatives came to support revision. Some defenders of Dreyfus carried prejudices of their own. For Jewish families, the violence of public language was not theoretical. Anti-Semitic riots broke out in several cities, especially in French Algeria. Shops were attacked. Crowds shouted that citizenship could be withdrawn from people whose legal equality had existed for generations. The affair showed how a trial could become a referendum on whether a minority belonged to the nation at all. It also produced new organizations. The League of the Rights of Man formed in the atmosphere of the Zola trial. Its members treated the case as a test of Republican law. On the other side, nationalist leagues presented revision as betrayal. Meetings, petitions, caricatures, songs, and newspaper campaigns surrounded the documents with emotion. The public debate often simplified the human beings inside it. Dreyfus could become a pure symbol of injustice, almost detached from his own voice. Picquart could become the flawless officer of conscience, though his path had included hesitation and prejudice. Zola could become the singular author of revision, obscuring years of labor by Lucy, Mathieu, Lazare, lawyers, journalists, and less famous witnesses. A careful history restores the symbols to sequence. On Devil's Island, Dreyfus received only delayed and censored traces of this transformation. He knew that advocates were working, but not every name or danger. At times, he feared the campaign had failed. At other times, an official change in tone suggested movement. He continued to ask for a lawful review rather than rescue by political favor. His insistence matters because it distinguishes two remedies. Mercy accepts the authority of a conviction and softens its consequence. Review tests the conviction itself. Dreyfus did not want only to leave the island. He wanted the judgment that placed him there to be examined with the evidence visible. Public pressure had made silence costly, but pressure could not annul a judgment. The record still needed a court with power to compel it. During the summer of 1898, a new war minister, Godefroy Cavaignac, believed he could end the affair by presenting decisive proofs. On the 7th of July, he addressed the Chamber of Deputies and read from secret documents. Legislators ordered the speech posted throughout France. What had once been too sensitive for the defense was now used as a public instrument of governmental certainty. Cavaignac's declaration seemed, for a moment, to strengthen the anti-Dreyfus position. The army possessed papers. The minister had named them. The debate could be dismissed as agitation against facts known to responsible authority. Yet the act of bringing the documents forward also exposed them to a kind of inspection they had avoided. Captain Louis Quignet, an officer on Cavaignac's staff, examined one of the supposed proofs. Under artificial light, he noticed that the paper did not belong together as it appeared. The pieces came from different sources. The physical construction revealed the intellectual construction. A text, treated as confirmation, had been assembled. The discovery climbed the chain of command until Henry was questioned on the 30th of August. He first resisted and then admitted making the false document. He was arrested and taken to the military prison at Mont Valérien. The next morning, he was found dead in his cell after cutting his throat. Henry's death produced shock, grief, and a new struggle over meaning. For revision supporters, the forgery proved that the secret case had been corrupted. For determined opponents, Henry became a patriot who had manufactured a paper only because genuine secrets could not be disclosed. A subscription raised money for his widow. Newspapers printed praise for what some called a patriotic forgery. Calling Henry's forgery patriotic exposed the defense of the old verdict. The paper's truth mattered less to its defenders than the work it performed for the army. Loyalty to a conclusion had replaced authenticity as the measure of evidence. Senior officers resigned. Cavaignac left the ministry, still resisting the inference that the forged proof undermined the case. Esterhazy fled first to Belgium and then to Britain. He would eventually acknowledge writing the bordereau while inventing explanations that shifted with circumstance. His escape did not automatically clear Dreyfus in law. It did make the refusal to review increasingly untenable. Henry's confession destroyed a proof. It did not destroy the verdict that the proof had been built to protect. Lucy submitted another petition. The government sent the case to the Court of Cassation. On the 27th of September, the Justice Minister asked the court's chief prosecutor to examine revision. The request identified contradictions in the handwriting evidence and Henry's forgery as new facts. For the first time, a civilian court with authority to review judgments began a sustained legal inquiry into the foundation of the conviction. The Court of Cassation revision was exceptional because it could require investigation of facts after a final judgment. The procedure was designed for the rare case in which new evidence made confidence in a conviction impossible. Chief Prosecutor Jean-Pierre Monod argued that the original case rested on fragile bases. The presumption of innocence, he said, protected not only an accused person before judgment, but also a convicted person who presented a qualifying new fact. The formulation returned Dreyfus to a legal category from which public rhetoric had removed him. He was not merely the condemned traitor. He was a petitioner whose conviction could be tested. On the 29th of October, the criminal chamber held the request admissible and ordered a deeper investigation. Magistrates gathered testimony and documents. They were not dependent upon the summaries supplied by the army. The process threatened every part of the protected narrative. Nationalist opponents attacked the judges, especially the president of the criminal chamber, Louis Loewe. Accusations of bias, conspiracy, and improper conduct filled the press. A former magistrate of the court made public charges against the chamber. Parliamentary pressure grew for the case to be removed from the criminal judges who had already done much of the investigative work. A special law transferred the final decision to all the chambers of the Court of Cassation sitting together. Supporters of the law said a matter of such importance required the broadest judicial authority. Critics saw an attempt to dilute or overturn the criminal chamber's work. Even the identity of the reviewing judges had become a political battlefield. The investigation nevertheless continued toward the material hidden in 1894. On the 17th of March, in 1899, the prosecutor requested the military secret dossiers. 4 days later, the court ordered their communication. The papers that had reached the first judges without passing the defense were now before magistrates charged with examining how the conviction had been made. The secret packet did not contain the certainty long attributed to it. Papers had been misunderstood, detached from context, or assigned to Dreyfus through ambiguous initials. Later materials had entered the archive. The Henry forgery demonstrated that the file's custodians could not be treated as neutral transmitters. The court could compare the aura of the dossier with its actual contents. The handwriting evidence also weakened. Esterhazy's connection to the bordereau could not be dismissed by repeating Bertillon's theory. The theory of self-forgery turned the absence of a stable match into proof of sophisticated disguise, but it lacked a sound method by which another examiner could test and falsify it. By May, Monod's final submission described not two new facts, but a larger set of defects. The case had changed scale. What began as a question about a forged paper and conflicting experts had become an examination of the whole path from suspicion to verdict. For the first time, the question was no longer whether Dreyfus resembled a traitor. It was whether any surviving item connected him to the bordereau. On the 3rd of June, all chambers of the Court of Cassation annulled the judgment of 1894. The court did not acquit Dreyfus. It sent him to a new court-martial at Rennes, because the military accusation had to be tried again. Legally, the first verdict was gone. Practically, he remained a prisoner awaiting judgment. The news crossed the Atlantic. Orders were sent to return him to France. After more than 4 years on the island, Dreyfus left the enclosure that had defined his days. He was thin, prematurely aged, and weakened by illness. The journey back did not feel like liberation. Another trial waited. He landed secretly at night and was taken to the military prison in Rennes. For the first time since his deportation, he could meet Lucy directly. Their reunion occurred under guard. The children he had imagined through letters were older. The body that returned to them bore the cost of time that no judgment could restore. The new court-martial opened in August. Reporters arrived from across Europe and the United States. Rennes became a temporary capital of the affair. The world expected a contest between the evidence uncovered by the Court of Cassation and the authority of generals who still defended the original case. Dreyfus sat in uniform before military judges. He had spent years without access to the arguments developed in his name. His memory was strong, but his physical presence disappointed spectators who expected a dramatic hero. He spoke precisely and sometimes without rhetorical ease. Critics again treated manner as evidence. His defense was divided between Edgar Demange, who favored a narrow and respectful argument, and Fernand Laborie, the forceful advocate who had defended Zola. Demange hoped to give the judges room to acquit without humiliating the army. Laborie wanted to confront the entire machinery of the false case. Their difference reflected a larger strategic question. Could the court be persuaded by restraint, or did restraint leave old authority intact? Former ministers and generals testified at length. Mercier defended his conduct. Gans and others sustained the accusation through recollections, interpretations, and secret information. The prosecution ranged beyond the bordereau into supposed admissions and character judgments that had already been challenged. At Rennes, the defense could finally contest the secret dossier. Exposure solved only the first problem. The officers presenting the papers still carried years of commitment to the conclusion those papers had once protected. The defense could finally see the papers. The harder problem was that the institution presenting them had not abandoned the conclusion. On the 14th of August, as Laborie walked to court, a gunman shot him in the back. He survived, but the wound removed him from crucial sessions. The attack gave physical form to the political violence around the trial. It also weakened the defense at the moment when cross-examination mattered most. Dreyfus watched generals speak of him as a traitor, while the man linked to the bordereau lived abroad. He rejected claims that he had confessed. After the first conviction, an officer had reported that Dreyfus made a partial admission while discussing motives and family. Dreyfus insisted his words had been distorted. The alleged confession had no signed record and did not fit his unbroken declarations of innocence. The court heard experts return to handwriting. Bertillon revived his elaborate construction. Diagrams, measurements, and mathematical language gave the theory an appearance of precision. Complexity can be mistaken for rigor when listeners cannot see which assumptions produce the result. Later scientific review would show that the argument reasoned from false documents and invalid probabilities. The judges retired on the 9th of September. By 5 votes to 2, they found Dreyfus guilty again. The verdict added extenuating circumstances, an almost incomprehensible qualification to the alleged act of betraying national defense. He was sentenced to 10 years of detention, with time already served counted. The result stunned revision supporters. A court had received the opportunity created by annulment and returned to guilt. The split vote and extenuating circumstances suggested compromise rather than coherent fact-finding. The army had preserved its verdict, but at the cost of making the verdict harder to explain. The government now faced a choice between legal purity and immediate human danger. Dreyfus's health was poor. Another period of confinement might kill him. The country had passed through years of trials, street violence, and ministerial crisis. Prime Minister Pierre Waldeck-Rousseau wanted to close the conflict and defend Republican government against nationalist movements. President Émile Loubet offered a pardon. A pardon could release Dreyfus without disturbing the new conviction. To officials seeking calm, that distinction was useful. To Dreyfus, it was cruel. Acceptance might be described as an admission that he preferred mercy to truth. Refusal would return him to prison and separate him again from Lucy and the children. His lawyers and family urged acceptance. On the 19th of September, Loubet signed the pardon. Dreyfus left custody. He made clear that he remained innocent and would continue seeking legal rehabilitation. Freedom came without restored rank, without a valid declaration of innocence, and without an answer from the institution that had convicted him twice. Dreyfus was free. The second conviction still stood, and every official record could still call him a traitor. Release and exoneration now followed separate paths. Leaving prison gave Dreyfus the ability to recover, read the record, work with lawyers, and live with his family. It also placed him outside confinement, while the guilty judgment remained in force. The next 7 years were shaped by that unresolved split. The pardon divided supporters. Some thought the immediate saving of a life justified compromise. Others feared the government would use freedom as a substitute for justice. Dreyfus himself accepted the practical mercy and rejected its legal meaning. This position was neither passive gratitude nor theatrical defiance. It was a demand that the state distinguish compassion from correction. He returned to a family household altered by absence. Pierre and Jean had lived through years in which newspapers discussed their father's guilt as a national fact. Lucy had become an advocate before ministers and courts, while preserving the private language of marriage in censored letters. Reunion could not simply restart the life interrupted in October of 1894. Dreyfus had to recover physically. His digestion, sleep, eyesight, and general strength had suffered. He found ordinary rooms and voices difficult after prolonged isolation. A person may dream of return as the restoration of normal life. Yet normal life contains noise, choice, and unguarded time that confinement has made unfamiliar. He also began organizing memory. During captivity, writing had kept identity intact. Now writing could place his experience into the public record. He assembled letters and composed an account later published as 5 Years of My Life. Its tone was controlled. He did not need to decorate Devil's Island with invented torments. The routine facts of surveillance, restraint, weather, illness, and distance were sufficient. The book offered a counterweight to the way others had narrated him. For years, judges, officers, experts, and journalists had interpreted his posture and silence. His own letters showed a man thinking about duty, family, endurance, and the precise legal form of vindication. They also showed repetition born from an existence with very few external events. Hope had to be stated again because there was nothing new to support it. The political government sought a broader settlement. In 1900, Parliament passed an amnesty covering many offenses connected to the affair. The measure aimed to stop the chain of prosecutions against officers, activists, and participants on both sides. It reduced political heat, but it also protected people whose conduct might otherwise have been examined in court. For Dreyfusards, amnesty posed the same tension as pardon. Peace could prevent further injury, yet peace declared too early could preserve an unjust record. A nation may grow tired of a case long before the person named in the judgment can afford to forget it. France tried to close the political fight. Dreyfus kept the legal question open. The Paris Exposition of 1900 gave France another public image, filled with electricity, machinery, architecture, and imperial display. Visitors could imagine a republic moving confidently into a new century. Beneath that surface, the affair had altered political alliances. Republican groups increasingly organized against clerical and nationalist influence. The army's place in public life was being renegotiated. Anti-Semitism had not disappeared. It had become one of the languages through which opponents of the Republic mobilized. Famous friendships and bitter estrangements followed. Writers and artists who had once shared salons no longer spoke. Families divided at dinner tables. Employers and employees signed opposing petitions. The case reached people who never read the full judgment because it asked a question larger than one handwriting sample. When an institution says its honor requires belief, what happens to a citizen who asks for proof? The answer was not owned by one political side. Some revision supporters cared deeply about legal process, while holding other undemocratic views. Some officers privately doubted the verdict, but feared public humiliation of the army. Some anti-Dreyfusards accepted particular defects, while insisting that national cohesion mattered more. History becomes less useful when these variations are flattened, but variation does not erase responsibility for what each person chose when evidence appeared. Jean Jaurès returned to the case with renewed force. The socialist deputy had moved from caution to committed advocacy. In speeches and a long series of articles, he examined the evidence and argued that the Republic could not build justice upon a military falsehood. His intervention helped move the affair from a family campaign toward a renewed parliamentary demand. Jaurès understood that the first review had not failed because no evidence existed. It had failed because evidence entered a court still constrained by the need to preserve military authority. A second review would have to be wider and more exact. It could not merely identify a new fact and send Dreyfus back to another court-martial. It would need to test the entire accusation. Political conditions changed after the victory of the Republican left. General Louis André became war minister and began examining the army's files with the help of Captain Antoine Louis Targe. Targe traced documents, alterations, and the handling of secret materials. The internal inquiry found additional reasons to distrust the Rennes conviction. The process was not a simple triumph of one faction taking power. The new ministers had their own political interests, and their methods could be criticized. What mattered for Dreyfus was that documentary examination resumed inside the state. Papers once presented as fixed proof were compared with originals, dates, handwriting, and the circumstances of their discovery. On the 6th of April in 1903, Jaurès delivered a major speech in the Chamber of Deputies. He reviewed contradictions and demanded action. The speech did not itself reopen the judgment, but it made official inaction harder. The government ordered a further administrative inquiry. Dreyfus prepared another request. On the 26th of November, he petitioned the Justice Minister for revision of the Rennes judgment. His submission identified new evidence concerning secret papers used in 1899. One document had been altered by substituting an initial. Another had received a date that made it appear relevant to a period when it had not existed in that form. The reliability of an intelligence source used against him was also in question. These details may seem small beside years of imprisonment, but a court works through details. An initial can attach a sentence to one person rather than another. A date can place a document before or after an alleged event. A copied phrase can lose the context that gives it meaning. The human scale of the affair depended upon the physical scale of marks on paper. The Justice Minister sent the request to the Court of Cassation. Chief Prosecutor Manuel Baudouin took up the case. The first review had concentrated upon a limited set of new facts and ended in a retrial. Baudouin proposed a more comprehensive examination. Once the court was validly seized of the case, he argued, it had broad power to conduct every search necessary for the discovery of truth. Dreyfus could now participate directly. He submitted a handwritten memorandum of more than 60 pages. Unlike the letters from Devil's Island, it was a technical legal document. He addressed handwriting, access, testimony, and the conduct of officials. The accused, who had once been excluded from the secret dossier, was now writing into the record that would judge it. His memorandum also recovered agency from the famous men around him. Zola had written the most celebrated accusation. Picquart had found Esterhazy. Jaurès had mobilized parliamentary argument. Yet Dreyfus was not an empty object carried by their courage. He studied the file and named the contradictions himself. His claim to honor included intellectual ownership of his defense. In January of 1904, Baudouin submitted a long argument for admitting the request. He reconstructed the original suspicion, the Picquart discovery, the Esterhazy proceedings, the secret dossier, Rennes, and the later findings. What had once been a compact accusation now required more than 100 pages simply to describe the reasons it might be unsafe. On the 5th of March, the criminal chamber declared the request admissible and ordered further investigation. Magistrates began a painstaking inquiry that lasted more than 2 years. They heard witnesses, commissioned experts, and examined the history of each charge. Time worked differently in this stage. Earlier turns had come with newspaper shocks, trials, arrests, and sudden deaths. The second review advanced through files, testimony, comparison, and patient accumulation. Its drama lay in the reduction of mystery. Each grand claim was returned to its source. This review produced no daily spectacle. Its pressure came from method. Every claim had to reveal its source. The bordereau remained the legal foundation. If Dreyfus had not written it, the structure of the accusation failed. The court therefore asked distinguished mathematicians and scientists to examine Bertillon's theory. Gaston Darboux, Paul Appel, and Henri Poincaré brought expertise in mathematics rather than criminal measurement theater. They found fundamental errors. Bertillon's calculations depended upon unjustified assumptions and distorted use of probability. Photographic enlargements and measurements had been handled in ways that did not support his conclusions. The experts summarized the problem with devastating clarity. The reasoning was bad, and the documents upon which it reasoned were false. The finding mattered beyond one expert's reputation. Bertillon's theory had given the first prosecution a way to convert mismatch into confirmation. Scientific language had insulated the claim from ordinary doubt. Once genuine specialists reconstructed the method, the insulation disappeared. Other charges dissolved under similar pressure. The alleged confessions rested on contested recollection rather than a reliable record. Character claims had no probative weight. Supposed access to every document listed in the bordereau did not fit the actual rotation of staff duties. Intercepted letters did not name Dreyfus securely. Some had been translated, summarized, or interpreted beyond what the text allowed. The court also examined the secret dossier used at Rennes. The fact that the second trial was public did not mean secrecy had ceased to influence it. Officers carried the authority of intelligence materials into their testimony. Papers had been altered or misidentified. The archive had become a mixture of original intelligence, institutional commentary, and attempts to protect the first verdict. Baudouin's final submission grew to more than 700 handwritten pages. Length alone does not prove truth. In this instance, length showed the work required to separate 12 years of accumulated claims. A false conclusion can be stated in a sentence. Correcting it may require the history of every step that made the sentence persuasive. The full Court of Cassation heard the case over 15 days. Lawyers and magistrates moved through handwriting, military access, foreign correspondence, secret files, alleged admissions, and the legal power to annul without sending Dreyfus to a third military trial. That final point mattered. In 1899, the court had annulled and remanded because a new tribunal was expected to decide guilt. Rennes had shown that another trial could reproduce the authority of the old accusation, even after its foundation weakened. The law allowed annulment without retrial if nothing punishable remained that could be attributed to the accused. On the 12th of July in 1906, the Court of Cassation delivered judgment. It considered the bordereau in handwriting and content. It reviewed the accessory charges, the claimed confessions, and the secret dossier. It found that the accusation was entirely unjustified and that none of the accumulated charges remained standing. The court had reached the answer. What remained was the harder accounting. What could a judgment restore after 12 years? And what could it never return? The court annulled the Rennes conviction without remand. It stated that the conviction had been pronounced by error and wrong. Dreyfus was authorized to publish the judgment at state expense in 50 newspapers of his choosing. The remedy recognized that the injustice had been public. Correction had to travel through some of the same channels that had carried condemnation. The judgment did not say only that procedure had been defective. It did not leave a cloud of factual suspicion over a fortunate defendant. It declared that the case had collapsed. The man pardoned in 1899 became, in law, innocent. News reached Dreyfus in Paris. The moment was quieter than the degradation ceremony and less visually dramatic than Zola's newspaper. No sword was restored in the courtroom. No years were returned. Yet the legal boundary had finally moved to where he had asked it to stand from the beginning. Evidence used against a person had been made answerable. Parliament passed measures restoring Dreyfus and Picquart to the army. Dreyfus returned with the rank of major and received the Legion of Honor. Picquart, whose career had also been broken, was promoted to general and later became war minister. Dreyfus and Picquart did not receive equal restoration. Dreyfus lost seniority because the army did not fully credit the years taken by wrongful conviction and imprisonment. Picquart's career advanced further. The law had removed guilt, while administrative calculation continued to carry the absence. On the 21st of July, Dreyfus received the Legion of Honor at the École Militaire. The place linked restoration to the courtyard where he had been degraded. The ceremony was restrained. The army did not collectively confess. A decoration recognized service and reinstatement, but it could not speak every sentence the history required. For Lucy, the judgment closed a legal campaign she had carried since the first prison visits. Her petitions had moved through systems that repeatedly asked her to wait. She had protected the children, managed correspondence, and endured public inspection of family life. The phrase rehabilitation often centers the officer whose rank returns. It should also include the family required to live inside the accusation. Mathieu saw the brother he had defended restored. His methods had changed over the years, from private approaches to public accusation. from handwriting searches to alliances with national figures. The campaign succeeded because no single path was sufficient. Family certainty needed documentary leads. Leads needed lawyers. Lawyers needed courts willing to receive them. Courts needed public space in which secrecy could not quietly close the matter again. Zola did not live to see the judgment. He died in 1902 after fumes from a blocked chimney filled his home. His death was officially treated as accidental, though rumors of hostile interference persisted without proof. His role in the affair survived because he used his fame to create legal risk for himself when safer voices had failed. Picquart lived to see the state accept what he had first reported inside the chain of command a decade earlier. His later prominence can make his initial choice seem inevitable. It was not. He could have accepted transfer and silence. He could have treated Esterházy as a separate problem. The moral weight lies in the fact that he had alternatives. Scheurer-Kestner died in 1901. Bernard Lazare followed in 1903. Others who opened the case did not reach its legal end. Long struggles distribute their outcome unevenly. Some people bear the early disbelief and vanish before vindication becomes official memory. Esterházy remained abroad and escaped a final prosecution for writing the bordereau. He gave interviews and changed his account. At times, he admitted authorship, while claiming he had acted under orders to trap Dreyfus. The explanations contradicted the evidence and each other. The Court of Cassation did not need to produce a satisfying punishment for Esterházy in order to decide that Dreyfus's conviction was wrong. This asymmetry can feel incomplete. The innocent man returned to rank, but the writer of the central memorandum lived outside the reach of the conclusion. Henry was dead. Ministers and generals had retired, resigned, or defended themselves. Law corrected the named judgment more effectively than it distributed responsibility for making and preserving it. The court's judgment was therefore both complete and limited. It completely removed the conviction. It could not completely repair the life, family, careers, and public trust damaged along the way. Legal remedies are most honest when their precision is not confused with total restoration. That limit changes the final question. Once the convictions were gone, which parts of the damage continued to live? Dreyfus remained in the army only briefly. The dispute over seniority left him disappointed and physically tired. In 1907, he retired. Retirement did not erase military identity. He had fought for restoration, partly because service represented the France he had chosen after Alsace was annexed. The next year brought another reminder that judicial closure did not end public hatred. The remains of Émile Zola were transferred to the Panthéon, where the Republic honored major national figures. Dreyfus attended the ceremony. A nationalist journalist named Louis Grégory stepped from the crowd and fired at him. A bullet wounded Dreyfus in the arm. Grégory was tried and acquitted. His defense presented the attack as a political gesture, rather than an attempt to murder a particular man. The outcome echoed an old danger. When an individual is made into a symbol, violence against his body can be described as argument. Dreyfus survived, but the ceremony meant to honor a defender of justice became another scene in which hostility reached him directly. He did not respond by abandoning public life entirely. He followed politics, maintained friendships, and defended the record of the case. Yet he generally avoided turning himself into a professional emblem. This reserve frustrated people who wanted a hero to perform constant public gratitude or indignation. Dreyfus had spent years being interpreted through expectations. He retained the right to live without satisfying another set. When the First World War began in 1914, he returned to service, despite age and damaged health. The German army entered France, and the conflict for which his generation of officers had prepared arrived on a scale none had imagined. Dreyfus served in artillery-related assignments and later received promotion. His son Pierre also served. The return has an emotional symmetry that should not be exaggerated. It did not prove innocence. The court had already done that. It did show that the state, once convinced he had betrayed national defense again, trusted him within that defense. The Alsatian child who chose French citizenship and the officer expelled as a traitor served France during its greatest military emergency. After the war, Dreyfus lived more quietly. The political coalitions formed around his case changed. New conflicts displaced the old newspaper battles, but the language of the affair remained available. To call an event an affair in the singular was to invoke a warning about secret evidence, anti-Semitism, military power, and the responsibility of intellectuals. The warning did not prevent later catastrophe. Anti-Semitic movements continued in France and across Europe. The belief that Jewish citizens could never fully belong survived the formal victory of Dreyfus's citizenship. During the Second World War, after Germany occupied France and the Vichy government collaborated in persecution, members of the wider Dreyfus family faced laws and violence more severe than the exclusions visible in 1894. Dreyfus did not live to see that war. He died in Paris in July of 1935. His death came one day before the anniversary of the judgment that cleared him. Obituaries returned to the degradation, the island, Zola, and rehabilitation. A life of more than 70 years was again organized around the 12 years in which the state called him guilty. One of his granddaughters, Madeleine Lévy, joined the resistance during the German occupation. French police arrested her. She was deported to Auschwitz and died there. The fact should not be used to turn the affair into a simple preface to the Holocaust. The political settings and mechanisms were different. It does show that legal rehabilitation in one generation did not dissolve the anti-Semitism capable of endangering the next. Lucy survived the occupation in hiding and died after the war. The letters she and Alfred had preserved became part of the documentary inheritance of the family. Private words written under censorship entered archives and museums. Their movement from guarded mail to public collection reversed the isolation for which they were created. The secret dossier followed its own archival path. For decades, historians reconstructed its contents through copies, testimony, and military holdings. The papers became accessible and were eventually digitized and restored. A file once powerful, because almost no one could inspect it, became an object that students and readers could examine page by page. Visibility, however, does not automatically produce understanding. An online image of a torn letter can look self-explanatory when it is not. The viewer still needs to know who wrote it, when it was intercepted, whether it is an original or copy, how it entered the dossier, and what claim officials attached to it. Open access repairs the boundary of secrecy. Historical method repairs the boundary of context. The bordereau offers the clearest example. Its existence is not disputed. Its handwriting and contents can be compared with surviving specimens and military duties. The document is real. The identification of Dreyfus as its writer was false. A genuine object can support a false claim when the bridge between object and person is built from assumption. The faux Henry shows the reverse problem. The object existed, but it was not genuine correspondence. Its physical seams mattered. A different paper, a joining of fragments, and an internal confession exposed manufacture. Yet the forgery had already shaped belief because readers encountered its claimed meaning before its material history. Between these objects sat the secret dossier as a system. It gathered genuine letters, uncertain reference, intelligence notes, and later additions beneath one label. The label suggested coherence. Once materials are placed together in an official file, proximity can be mistaken for relationship. A paper about one agent can seem to illuminate another because both occupy the same folder. That is why the Order of March in 1899 was more than an administrative request. The Court of Cassation forced the institution to disaggregate the file. Each item had to answer separate questions. Who produced it? What did it literally say? What did the first judges think it said? Was that inference available to challenge? Had the item existed when the conviction was reached? The review also exposed the cost of preserving a verdict. The original error did not require every participant to act corruptly. Some experts were mistaken. Some officers trusted colleagues. Some politicians feared disorder. Some journalists exploited hatred. These motives accumulated. Later, when Picquart found Esterhazy, the institution had a chance to separate honest error from deliberate defense. It chose defense. After that choice, new acts were required. Picquart had to be removed. His credibility had to be attacked. Esterhazy had to be protected or at least acquitted. Henry had to supply stronger paper. Ministers had to repeat confidence. Each act created another interest in avoiding review. This pattern explains why the affair lasted beyond the exposure of a single forgery. A common story says that Henry confessed. The false case collapsed, and justice followed. The actual sequence includes another conviction after the confession. Evidence can make an old conclusion untenable without making institutions immediately able to abandon it. The Rennes verdict is the center of that difficulty. By then, the world knew Esterhazy's handwriting, Picquart's discovery, and Henry's forgery. The first judgment had been annulled. Still, 5 military judges voted guilty. They may not all have believed every old charge. The verdict, with extenuating circumstances, suggests that institutional reconciliation was being attempted through the body of the accused. The chronology is complete. To see why the case survived for 12 years, the evidence now has to be taken apart one object at a time. The first object is the bordereau. It was a real memorandum, written by someone who offered military information to the German attaché. That limited fact was never the problem. The dangerous step came next, when investigators moved from a document to a name. They assumed the writer worked in a particular part of the general staff. They narrowed the field. Dreyfus entered it. His handwriting did not provide a clean match, so disagreement among experts should have slowed the case. Instead, disagreement created room for a theory that could absorb almost any result. Alphonse Bertillon's theory gave the mismatch a purpose. According to his construction, Dreyfus had imitated his own handwriting while trying to make it look unlike his ordinary hand. A resemblance could therefore support guilt, but a difference could support guilt as well. The theory removed the ordinary condition that makes a test useful, the possibility of failure. Once every outcome points in the same direction, the test no longer separates one explanation from another. The prosecution also tried to connect the subjects listed in the bordereau to Dreyfus's military access. That connection looked stronger when described in broad terms than when examined item by item. A trainee on the general staff could know military matters. Access in general was not proof that he possessed the exact papers offered to Germany. The record contained no direct witness to a delivery, no payment record tying him to the German embassy, and no signed admission. Espionage can leave a thin trail, but a thin trail cannot be repaired by treating every missing link as evidence of professional skill. Years later, the Court of Cassation returned to the bordereau with better comparison material and specialists able to explain their methods. The question was no longer whether a diagram looked impressive. It was whether the handwriting and content could support the identification. They could not. The document that began the prosecution remained genuine. The bridge from that document to Alfred Dreyfus did not. That distinction supplied the first payoff of the final review. A genuine paper had carried a false identity. The next paper did the opposite. It carried a genuine address toward the person whom the first investigation had missed. The Petit Bleu was a torn telegram form addressed by the German military attaché to Major Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy. Picquart found it while directing the same intelligence section that had worked against Dreyfus. He did not begin as a campaigner for revision. He began with a professional comparison. The handwriting of Esterhazy resembled the bordereau. His contact with the attaché gave the resemblance a setting. The new evidence did not merely add another possible spy. It struck the foundation of the earlier verdict. Picquart's superiors tried to separate the cases. They could pursue Esterhazy, they suggested, without reopening Dreyfus. The separation could not hold. If Esterhazy had written the memorandum used to condemn Dreyfus, then a new inquiry was not a second case running beside the first. It was evidence that the first case had named the wrong man. The response to Picquart changed the character of the affair, moving him away from Paris, restricting his access, attacking his conduct, and eventually imprisoning him did not prove that every superior knew Dreyfus was innocent. It proved something narrower and well documented. The institution treated the officer carrying corrective evidence as a threat to the verdict. That choice made later correction more difficult and increased the cost of admitting the mistake. The Petit Bleu also changed the family campaign. Matthew Dreyfus had spent years looking for a mechanism of error. A resemblance in the bordereau and a trail toward Esterhazy supplied one. Bernard Lazare could turn the family claim into a documented argument. Scheuer-Kestner could take the evidence to ministers without asking them to rely on affection or rumor. The case now had an alternative author, an intelligence lead, and an officer inside the service who had followed it. Yet Esterhazy was acquitted. The paper had opened a route toward correction, and the court-martial closed it. That closure explains why the affair moved from private petitions to public confrontation. Zola did not create the underlying evidence. He made the refusal to examine it impossible to hide. The third object is the faux Henry. Unlike the bordereau and the Petit Bleu, it was manufactured inside the intelligence service. Hubert Henry assembled it after the first conviction, when doubt about the verdict was increasing. The paper appeared to confirm a direct connection between Dreyfus and foreign officers. It performed exactly the function the original file lacked. For a time, the forgery worked because officials encountered its meaning before they examined its construction. A document carried by a trusted intelligence officer and presented as secret proof arrived with institutional authority already attached. Readers did not see two paper stalks joined together. They saw confirmation. That sequence matters. Once a paper has settled a fear, later physical defects must compete with the conclusion it helped create. Captain Louis Quignet reversed that sequence. He inspected the object. Under artificial light, the difference in paper became visible. The supposed correspondence no longer arrived as a claim about treason. It became a material problem with seams, provenance, and an identifiable chain of custody. Henry was questioned. He confessed. The paper that had reinforced the accusation became evidence about the people maintaining it. The confession did not produce an immediate collapse. Some defenders of Henry described the forgery as patriotic, as though a false paper could be excused by the institution it protected. That response shows how far the dispute had moved from the original question. The issue was no longer simply whether Dreyfus had written the bordereau. It was whether preserving the army's authority could justify manufacturing support for a verdict. Henry's death the next day prevented a full examination of his motives and contacts. The record supports the fact of his forgery and confession. It does not support every later theory about a coordinated plan extending through the entire officer corps. His individual act was deliberate. The reliance placed upon his paper was broader. Those two levels of responsibility should remain separate. The forgery created a clean opening for review, but it also exposed a deeper problem. Removing one false paper could not tell the court which other materials had been misunderstood, added later, or carried into the case through unrecorded channels. The entire secret dossier had to be opened. The dossier is the fourth object, though it was never a single coherent piece of evidence. It gathered intercepted foreign correspondence, copies, intelligence notes, translations, initials, commentaries, and later additions under one official label. The label made the contents look related. Some were not. A letter concerning one agent could sit beside a note about another, and the physical proximity encouraged readers to build a connection the texts did not establish. Classification added another layer of persuasion. Secret information often feels more serious than information stated in open court. The restriction suggests danger, privileged access, and facts too sensitive for ordinary challenge. In the Dreyfus trial, that psychological force favored the prosecution twice. The judges could assume the hidden papers explained weaknesses in the visible case, while the defense had no way to show that several papers were irrelevant, ambiguous, or wrongly attributed. The dossier also changed over time. Material present after the conviction could be remembered as though it had supported the verdict from the beginning. Copies could be treated as separate confirmation when they repeated the same source. Commentary could harden an uncertain interpretation into a fact. Without a reliable inventory, date, and provenance for each item, the thickness of the file said little about the number of independent claims inside it. The Court of Cassation's order in March of 1899 broke that illusion of coherence. The army had to produce the dossiers. Magistrates could ask when each item entered the collection, who supplied it, what it literally said, and how earlier judges had interpreted it. A file that had operated as a sealed symbol became a group of documents with separate histories. Once separated, the papers lost much of their combined force. Ambiguous initials did not identify Dreyfus merely because an intelligence note said they did. Foreign correspondence did not prove his guilt when the people named in it were unrelated to him. Henry's paper could not confirm the accusation after its manufacture was known. The dossier did contain real intelligence. It did not contain a reliable path from Dreyfus to the bordereau. That finding answers the question raised in the opening. but it does not yet explain the second conviction at Rennes. By the summer of 1899, the first judgment had been annulled. Esterhazy's handwriting was public, Picquart had testified, and Henry's forgery was known. The defense could examine materials previously withheld. The second court nevertheless returned guilt by 5 votes to 2. Rennes shows that disclosure alone does not erase an institution's prior commitment. The papers were visible, but generals carried the authority of earlier secrecy into their testimony. Recollections of an alleged confession could be repeated without a reliable contemporary record. Bertillon could revive his theory with diagrams and calculations. The bordereau still sat at the center, surrounded by years of official statements that had treated guilt as settled. The second court-martial was also judging more than a captain. An acquittal would imply that the first judges, ministers, experts, and senior officers had condemned an innocent man. It would give weight to Picquart, Zola, Lazare, the Dreyfus family, and politicians whom many officers regarded as enemies of the army. None of those pressures changed the handwriting. They changed the cost attached to accepting what the handwriting showed. The verdict of guilty with extenuating circumstances revealed the strain. Treason based on the deliberate transfer of military secrets did not naturally invite mitigation. The compromise looked less like a measured finding about the act, and more like an attempt to preserve guilt while reducing the consequence. A person had either written the bordereau or had not. Extenuating circumstances could not make the handwriting partly his. The pardon solved the immediate human emergency. Dreyfus's health had been damaged by years of confinement, and another long imprisonment carried grave risk. His family and lawyers urged acceptance. Freedom allowed him to return home, recover, work with counsel, and prepare a new petition, but the pardon preserved the judgment. It released a man whom the state still described as guilty. That distinction explains why the case continued for 7 more years. Dreyfus was not asking the government to be kind to a traitor. He was asking the law to remove a false conviction. The line between mercy and correction shaped the years after Rennes. Parliament could pass an amnesty for offenses connected to the political conflict. Newspapers could lose interest. Former allies could decide that peace mattered more than another legal battle. None of those choices altered the authorship of the bordereau. Dreyfus kept the question alive because the official answer followed him outside prison. A conviction affects more than confinement. It changes military rank, pension, family name, public memory, and the way later records describe a life. Pierre and Jane would inherit the judgment in every account that called their father a traitor. Lucy's years of petitions could be recast as loyalty to a guilty husband. A pardon softened punishment. It left all of those consequences attached to the verdict. Dreyfus therefore began to organize his own record. During captivity, his letters had preserved a voice that officials and newspapers often replaced with interpretations of his posture, silence, and character. After his release, he could write directly about arrest, trial, isolation, and the continuing demand for revision. His memoir did not replace court evidence. It restored the accused person to a history in which other men had repeatedly spoken for him. His later memorandum to the Court of Cassation went further. It was not a private appeal for sympathy. It engaged the documents, dates, alleged admissions, expert claims, and legal contradictions. Zola had made the accusation against the state famous. Picquart had found the alternative suspect. Jaurès had reopened the case in politics. Dreyfus now entered the technical record in his own hand. The movement from censored letters to a legal memorandum marks a quiet change in agency. On Devil's Island, he often learned about events months after they happened. His letters had to pass through censors. News traveled across the Atlantic and through colonial administration. He could insist upon innocence, ask about his children, and request information, but he could not examine each development in France as it occurred. Lucy wrote under the same constraints from the other direction. She had to sustain a husband whose health and knowledge were limited, while managing petitions, lawyers, family, and children. A household detail could reassure him. Political information might be delayed or removed. Her correspondence joined private care to a public campaign, without turning either role into a performance. Mathieu worked on a faster calendar. He met journalists, handwriting specialists, lawyers, and politicians. He pursued leads that failed and preserved those that did not. Family certainty by itself could be dismissed as devotion. Mathieu's task was to find evidence that would remain persuasive when separated from the family's belief. The facsimile recognized by Maurice Castro, the trail toward Esterhazy, and the alliances with Lazare and Scheurer-Kestner gave the campaign that form. The difference between the island and Paris created an unusual division of labor. Alfred Dreyfus maintained the claim and documented confinement. Lucy carried the legal right to petition and held the family together. Mathieu searched for the mechanism of error. None could compel the army to produce the secret file. Their work kept the case alive until someone with that authority was willing to use it. The correspondence shows the human cost without requiring invented scenes. Dates reveal delay. Censorship marks reveal control. Repeated questions about the children reveal absence. Changes in health appear through the practical language of letters and requests. The record is strong enough. It does not need imagined final words, reconstructed private conversations, or dramatic weather added to the island. This restraint matters because the case was distorted from the beginning by interpretations of behavior. Reporters treated Dreyfus's posture at the degradation as evidence of character. Officers treated his composure or distress as signs that could be read toward guilt. A responsible account should not repeat that method in sympathetic form by inventing emotions the documents do not record. The letters provide something more useful. They show persistence over time. A man who could not see the secret accusation continued to deny the visible one. A wife who could not control the pace of institutions continued to file petitions. A brother who could not command an inquiry continued to build one from paper, testimony, and contact. The campaign did not advance through a single heroic gesture. It survived through work that had to be repeated after each refusal. That work becomes clearer when the people in the correction chain are kept distinct. Marie Bastien recovered discarded papers from the German embassy and passed them to French intelligence. Her work served a legitimate counterintelligence purpose. The failure did not begin because documents were collected. It began when uncertain material was attached to a suspect and then protected from challenge. Picquart occupied a different position. He held official access, saw the Petit Bleu, compared handwriting, and reported through the chain of command. His later importance can make his decision appear inevitable. It was not. He had career, rank, and institutional loyalty to lose. The record shows what he did. He refused to treat Esterhazy's connection as irrelevant to Dreyfus. Louis Leblois preserved the route out of the closed office. Scheurer-Kestner gave the information political credibility and tried private correction before public accusation. Bernard Lazare produced an early written case when respectable opinion remained hostile. Their actions did not duplicate one another. Each moved the same evidence across a boundary the previous person could not cross. Zola then used public reputation as leverage. His article named officials and forced a libel trial in which the underlying affair could be discussed. He did not possess every later document, and his fame did not make each sentence infallible. His contribution was procedural as much as literary. Prosecution gave the defense a courtroom, witnesses, and a public record at a moment when military channels had closed. Quignet's role was narrower and just as decisive. He inspected Henry's paper closely enough to notice its construction. Manau and Baudouin performed slower work inside the Court of Cassation. They organized claims, requested files, compared sources, and defined the legal question. Scientists later tested Bertillon's method rather than his confidence. The correction chain required public pressure, but it also required people willing to do unglamorous technical work. No single participant controlled the result. Picquart could expose Esterhazy, but could not annul a judgment. Zola could create scrutiny, but could not decide the case. Lucy could petition, but could not order production of the dossier. The Court of Cassation could compel papers and issue judgment, but only after evidence and argument reached it in a usable form. The chain also explains why justice was delayed without being inevitable. If Picquart had remained silent, the Petit Bleu might have stayed an unrelated fragment. If Leblanc had kept the information private, Schorer-Kestner might never have acted. If Quignet had accepted the faux Henry at its claimed meaning, the forgery might have retained authority. If Dreyfus had accepted pardon as the end, the Rennes verdict might have remained the final legal word. Each person faced different pressure, and their motives were not identical. Some were Republicans, some military officers, some family, some lawyers, some writers, and some scientists. Treating them as one unified movement would flatten the mechanism. They succeeded because separate forms of power answered separate forms of resistance. The same care is necessary when assigning responsibility on the other side. The first investigators could be mistaken without participating in a later forgery. Mercier's authorization of secret material was a distinct decision. Gonce's resistance to Picquart carried another responsibility. Henry manufactured a false paper. Judges at Rennes voted with more corrective evidence available than the first court possessed. Responsibility grew as the facts changed. In October of 1894, investigators had a real memorandum, a serious security concern, and a suspect selected through weak reasoning and prejudice. By 1896, Esterhazy's handwriting and the Petit Bleu had undermined the identification. By 1898, Henry's confession had damaged the integrity of the protected file. By Rennes, a new tribunal had access to warnings the first judges never received. This sequence avoids two opposite errors. It does not excuse later conduct by saying the original case was difficult. It also does not invent a single conspiracy planned from the first arrest. The affair developed through mistaken identification, anti-Semitic expectation, secrecy, deference, career protection, deliberate forgery, political pressure, and repeated attempts to preserve an existing result. Coordination existed in particular acts. The full history was less tidy and more durable than one hidden plan. Anti-Semitism was not an atmosphere floating outside those decisions. It shaped the initial plausibility of the suspect and the public cost of correction. Dreyfus's position as a Jewish officer from Alsace could be read against him in opposite ways. His success suggested access. His wealth suggested motive. His assimilation suggested concealment. When prejudice can reinterpret any fact, it works like a defective forensic theory. It closes the possibility of disproof. The press magnified that structure. Anti-Semitic newspapers announced guilt before trial and treated Jewish citizenship as a national danger. Riots and attacks showed that the issue had moved beyond one officer. Other newspapers later published the bordereau, testimony, and arguments that made scrutiny possible. Publicity did not carry one moral direction. It could poison a jury of opinion or expose a closed institution. The legal safeguard is not that public opinion should decide guilt. Crowds at the degradation and cheers after Esterhazy's acquittal show how easily applause can reward error. Publicity matters when it allows claims about state action to be examined. The verdict still has to rest on evidence that can survive a disciplined answer. The expert evidence deserves the same separation. Some handwriting examiners disagreed. Disagreement is not proof of misconduct. The deeper failure came from Bertillon's self-forgery theory, because it made contrary handwriting features serve the accusation. Later mathematicians and scientists did not merely prefer another style of expertise. They reconstructed the method and showed why its assumptions could not support the conclusion. The distinction between expertise and authority is visible in the diagrams. Measurements, enlargements, and mathematical terms can make a claim feel mechanical and therefore neutral. The appearance of precision is not the same as a valid method. A court needs to know what data entered the calculation, which assumptions were chosen, and what result would count against the theory. The dossier produced a similar effect through physical form. Folders, seals, copies, and official annotations suggested accumulated proof. Once the Court of Cassation separated sources from commentary and early material from later editions, quantity lost much of its force. Several pages could repeat one uncertain identification. A note could repeat what another officer had said without adding independent evidence. The blank spaces remained important. No direct witness placed the bordereau in Dreyfus's hand. No reliable payment trail connected him to the German attaché. No proved possession tied him to the exact materials offered. Negative evidence must be handled carefully, because absence alone does not always establish innocence. Here, it mattered, because the prosecution asked inference to carry nearly every essential link. Esterhazy supplied positive evidence in another direction. His handwriting matched the bordereau more closely. The petit bleu connected him to Schwarzkoppen. His circumstances gave investigators reasons to examine him. Yet the institution spent energy defending the old verdict, while the man connected to the originating paper left France and avoided a final accounting. That outcome reveals a security cost often lost in the political story. Protecting a false accusation did not merely harm an innocent officer. It diverted attention from the person linked to the memorandum. Institutional prestige and national security were presented as reasons to resist revision, but resistance weakened the investigation of the actual leak. Military secrecy itself was not imaginary. France had legitimate reasons to protect intelligence sources, intercepted correspondence, and diplomatic methods. The Court of Cassation did not need to deny those reasons in order to find the trial unfair. The problem was the use of hidden material to decide guilt without a meaningful route for the defense to challenge identity, relevance, authenticity, or context. Other handling choices existed even in a sensitive case. Material that could not be tested could be excluded. Its substance could be summarized under controlled conditions. Judges could screen relevance without receiving a prosecution narrative unavailable to the defense. No method removes every risk. What failed in 1894 was the decision to let one side change the evidentiary field after the courtroom closed. The surviving record cannot tell us how much weight each of the 7 judges gave the packet. Some may have treated it as confirmation. Others may have considered it decisive. Fairness does not depend on reading their private thoughts. Demange lost the chance to show that an initial referred to someone else, that a letter concerned another agent, that a translation was uncertain, or that a later commentary had been mistaken for original evidence. The lost opportunity is enough to explain the legal wrong. A defense right protects the chance to answer before punishment, not a guarantee that the answer will succeed. The judges might still have convicted after controlled disclosure. The trial denied Dreyfus even that possibility. The questions denied to Demange can be stated without inventing the answers he would have received. For each letter, he could have asked who wrote it, when intelligence obtained it, whether the exhibit was an original or a copy, and what chain connected it to Dreyfus. Those questions would have separated the document's existence from the prosecution's interpretation. An ambiguous initial required its own test. Did the surrounding correspondence identify a person, or had officers supplied the identity from assumption? A pronoun in foreign correspondence could not bear the weight of a treason conviction unless its referent was established. Translation introduced another point of challenge, because a word chosen by an intelligence officer could make an uncertain passage sound direct. Timing mattered as much as language. A paper added after December of 1894 could not have supported the first judges, however important it appeared in a later folder. Commentary written after the verdict needed to remain visibly later. Without dates and provenance, the file allowed subsequent certainty to flow backward into the original case. The handwriting evidence required method rather than rank. Demange could have asked what features each examiner compared, where the specimens came from, and what result would count against identification. Bertillon's theory would then have faced its central weakness in open court. If resemblance proved authorship and difference proved disguise, the theory had no losing condition. Authenticity was another separate issue. The faux Henry shows why trust in the transmitting office could not replace inspection of the paper. A court needed to know whether seams, inks, paper stocks, and custody matched the story told about the object. The later discovery of manufacture did not create this duty. It revealed the cost of having skipped it. None of these questions guaranteed acquittal. Together, they would have forced the prosecution to show the bridge from secret intelligence to the accused. The first trial allowed that bridge to remain implied. The Court of Cassation later examined the same points because the defense had been denied the chance when the verdict was still open. The final Court of Cassation judgment addressed both the procedural failure and the factual collapse. It did not merely forgive a technical defect. It examined the bordereau, alleged confessions, secret materials, and expert claims. It found that nothing punishable remained that could be attributed to Dreyfus and annulled the Rennes conviction without another trial. Publication in 50 newspapers was part of the remedy. The original accusation had spread through headlines and public ceremony. A judgment kept inside the court record would not reach the same public field. Printing the decision could not make every reader accept it, but it gave legal innocence a distribution closer to the distribution of guilt. Restoration to the Army and the Legion of Honor carried the same public purpose. The state returned rank and decoration to the man it had expelled as a traitor. The ceremony at the École Militaire linked the correction to the place of degradation. Yet the administrative calculation did not give Dreyfus all the seniority he would likely have gained without the wrongful years. He retired disappointed and in poor health. The limit is easy to state and difficult to measure. A court could cancel the conviction. It could not return childhood years to Pierre and Jean, remove censorship from the letters, give Lucy back the years of petitioning, or restore Zola, Lazare, and Schorer-Kessner to see the legal end. It could not make every newspaper retract or every opponent change his mind. Dreyfus's later life prevents the case from ending at the courthouse. He returned to military service during the First World War. That service did not prove his innocence, because the court had already done so. It showed that the state, once convinced he had betrayed national defense, again trusted him within it. Hostility also survived. At the ceremony transferring Zola's remains to the Panthéon, Louis Gregory shot Dreyfus in the arm. Dreyfus survived. Gregory was acquitted. Legal rehabilitation had changed the official record, but it had not erased the political image built around the affair. The papers followed a slower path. Family letters, court submissions, intelligence records, newspapers, and copies entered archives and collections. Their survival allowed later historians to compare not only what officials concluded, but how each conclusion had been built. Archival access reverses one part of the original imbalance. In 1894, 7 judges saw materials denied to the accused and his lawyer. Today, many of those papers can be studied through public institutions. Access alone does not explain them. A torn letter still needs a date, author, chain of custody, and account of the claim attached to it. An image without provenance can repeat the old error in a new form. Conservation of the secret dossier makes that work possible. Stabilizing paper does not restore the authority the file once claimed. It preserves the evidence of how authority was used. Catalog descriptions separate items that the old label had made deceptively coherent. Modern commemoration adds another layer. France's posthumous promotion of Dreyfus to Brigadier General addressed the military career the wrongful conviction had interrupted. The national commemoration in 2026 and the statue beside the Court of Cassation placed public memory near the institution that finally annulled the case. Those acts did not discover a new innocence. The legal finding had stood since 1906. They changed which parts of the story the state chose to display. A broken sword had once supplied the dominant public image. The later memorial points toward a judgment and an open archive. 2 kinds of record had moved through the affair at different speeds. The state produced arrest reports, intelligence summaries, ministerial notes, orders, expert opinions, and judgments. The family produced letters, petitions, private memoranda, and copies, preserved because official custody could not be trusted to tell the whole story. Neither group of papers is complete by itself. Official documents identify decisions and authority. They show who requested a file, who signed an order, which court admitted a petition, and how a judgment described its legal basis. Their formal language can hide the force of what happened. An order for enhanced security on Devil's Island may look administrative until it is placed beside Dreyfus's account of restraint and deteriorating health. Family correspondence reverses that emphasis. It records separation, delay, uncertainty, and the work required to keep a case alive. It cannot by itself prove who wrote the bordereau. Lucy's confidence in her husband is evidence about the family and its campaign, not independent handwriting analysis. Mathieu's belief explains his persistence, But the Petit Bleu and Esterhazy comparisons are what gave that persistence evidentiary force. The archive becomes most useful when these records are placed beside one another without asking either to perform the other's job. A prison letter can show what confinement did to communication. A ministerial order can show who authorized the condition. A court submission can show how the order later entered legal argument. The relationship among documents supplies information that no isolated page contains. That method also protects the story from hindsight. Knowing the final judgment makes every earlier warning look obvious. It was not obvious to everyone at the time, and the evidence did not arrive in one packet marked correction. In 1894, investigators had the bordereau and a disputed comparison. In 1896, Picquart added Esterhazy and the Petit Bleu. In 1898, Quignet exposed Henry's forgery. In 1899, the Court of Cassation forced the dossier into review. Each date changed what a responsible official could continue to believe. The public conflict changed in the same stages. Early press coverage treated accusation as proof and Jewish identity as motive. Lazar's pamphlet offered a written countercase, but it reached a country already saturated with claims of treason. The facsimile of the bordereau gave readers something concrete to compare. Zola's article named responsibility. His trial placed officers and documents into a public record. The Henry Confession then gave revision supporters an admission that could not be dismissed as family advocacy. The labels Dreyfusard and anti-Dreyfusard made the division easier to describe and harder to understand. Revision supporters did not agree on every political question. Some defended the Republic, others socialism, legal liberalism, or the narrower demand for a new trial. Officers who doubted part of the case did not always support public revision. Opponents included military loyalists, nationalists, monarchists, anti-Semitic activists, and people who feared that reopening the verdict would produce disorder. These differences mattered because the correction required alliances among people who did not share one program. A senator could carry evidence that a radical pamphleteer had already published. A socialist deputy could use work produced by military officers and conservative lawyers. A civilian court could rely on information first found inside intelligence. The coalition held around a legal question before it held around a political identity. The opposing coalition also worked through separate motives that produced the same practical result. One official might fear exposure of intelligence methods. Another might fear humiliation of the army. A newspaper could profit from anti-Semitic outrage. A politician could use the affair against the Republic. None needed to share Henry's decision to forge a paper in order to repeat the certainty that the paper supported. This is where anti-Semitism altered more than tone. It reduced the amount of evidence needed to make Dreyfus appear plausible as a traitor. Public language presented Jewish identity as a hidden allegiance stronger than citizenship or military oath. Once that premise was accepted, ordinary facts could be recoded. His family's money suggested corruption. His education suggested cunning. His Alsatian background placed Germany close to his biography, even though his family had chosen France after annexation. The same premise made revision look suspect. If supporters of Dreyfus were described as agents of a Jewish interest, then requests for disclosure could be treated as attacks on France. The argument protected itself by redefining contrary evidence as proof of the conspiracy it alleged. Legal equality remained written in Republican law, while political language taught crowds to doubt whether it applied. Violence followed that language. Anti-Semitic riots broke out in several cities, with especially serious attacks in French Algeria. Shops were damaged, and Jewish residents threatened. The case of one officer became a public test of whether a minority could claim the protection of national institutions when the accusation involved the nation itself. The League of the Rights of Man emerged from this environment. Its formation did not resolve the affair, but it gave the demand for revision an organization beyond family and newspaper networks. The case became attached to a broader argument that state authority remained subject to evidence, even when the state invoked military danger. Republican governments later asserted greater civilian control over the army. Political alliances formed during the affair influenced other conflicts, including the struggle over the place of the Catholic Church in public life. No single reform should be credited entirely to Dreyfus. The affair acted as a pressure test. It exposed which institutions could correct themselves, which resisted, and which new organizations formed in response. International attention increased the pressure. Newspapers in Europe and the United States followed the trials, translated testimony, and reported on Zola, Picquart, Rennes, and the final review. Foreign concern did not make other nations morally superior. They carried racial, colonial, and legal injustices of their own. It did make it harder for French authorities to treat the case as a sealed domestic matter. Dreyfus did not answer rejection by abandoning his claim to France. His family had chosen French nationality after Alsace became German. He built a military career inside the Republic and continued to describe vindication as restoration within French law. That attachment can sound paradoxical only if France is reduced to the officers, judges, and crowds who condemned him. For Dreyfus, France also meant Lucy, Pierre, Jean, chosen citizenship, military duty, and the legal system to which he kept appealing. He did not need to deny the injustice in order to maintain that belonging. His demand was difficult precisely because it required the country to recognize him as one of its own, while admitting what its institutions had done. His return to service during the First World War carried that continuity into a new conflict with Germany. The symbolism is striking, but it should remain bounded. Wartime service was not a test capable of proving innocence retroactively. It was a later action by a man already cleared, and a state decision to use the service of an officer it had once expelled. After the war, the affair did not disappear. Political movements continued to use its names and symbols. Supporters remembered Zola's intervention and the Court of Cassation's judgment. Opponents preserved stories of betrayal and national humiliation. The legal answer remained stable, while public memory moved unevenly around it. Dreyfus lived until 1935. Obituaries could now describe the conviction as an injustice, but the calm language of retrospective agreement should not hide how long correction had taken. Many participants never changed their positions. Esther Hazy remained abroad and altered his accounts. Mercier defended the accusation after its foundation had failed. The judgment ended the case in law without producing a common memory. The next generation encountered a Europe in which anti-Semitism became still more dangerous. Madeleine Lévy's arrest and death belong to the history of occupation, collaboration, resistance, and genocide, not to a continuation of the same court case. The family connection nevertheless prevents the Dreyfus story from being sealed safely inside the 19th century. Archives keep that boundary open. The letters of Alfred and Lucy preserve private language shaped by censorship. Court files preserve the legal path from petition to annulment. Museum collections hold family objects and documentary traces. Newspapers preserve both the campaign of hatred and the publicity that later made concealment harder. The physical condition of a document can carry evidence that transcription loses. The faux Henry mattered as language, but its joined papers exposed manufacture. A torn telegram carried the path by which the Petit Bleu entered intelligence. Handwriting specimens allowed comparisons across authors. Conservation protects those features so later readers can examine the material object rather than rely only on an official description of it. Digitization widens access but changes scale. A viewer can enlarge a letter beyond the size at which an earlier reader handled it. Search can place references beside one another quickly. These tools help comparison. They can also strip an image from its folder, date, and provenance. The same fragment can be made to support a new false story if the catalog record is ignored. Public institutions, therefore, do more than place images online. They describe custody, date, authorship, relation to other items, and uncertainty. A responsible caption can prevent a copy from being mistaken for an original or a later edition from being placed at the first trial. The work is quiet, but it answers the exact weakness that once gave the secret dossier its false unity. Modern memorials operate differently. A statue, anniversary, or posthumous promotion compresses a long legal history into one visible statement. That compression can be useful when it points back toward the record. It becomes misleading if ceremony is allowed to suggest that recognition returned everything that was lost. The posthumous promotion to brigadier general addressed the military seniority that rehabilitation had not fully repaired. The national commemoration in 2026 placed official attention on recognition of innocence. The statue near the Court of Cassation connected public memory to the institution that issued the final judgment. None of these acts change the evidence. They change the setting in which the evidence is remembered. The broken sword had once represented expulsion. Zola's headline represented accusation against the state. The court's published judgment represented legal correction. The open dossier now allows those images to be checked against the papers that gave them meaning. That sequence keeps commemoration from becoming self-congratulation. Later governments and judges are not identical to the officials of 1894. They do not inherit personal guilt. They inherit institutions, records, and the duty to preserve the safeguards the case revealed as necessary. The most useful memory is therefore procedural and specific. A suspect was selected through weak reasoning shaped by prejudice. Secret material entered deliberation beyond the defense. Corrective evidence was resisted. A forged paper reinforced the old verdict. A court eventually compelled the archive and tested each claim. These are actions and decisions that can be recognized again without pretending every later case is the same. By the time the modern public reaches the restored file, the room of 1894 is gone. The 7 judges cannot explain their private weighting of the packet. Demange cannot perform the cross-examination he was denied. Dreyfus cannot recover the years represented by those pages. The archive cannot reverse time. It can preserve enough detail to prevent the old certainty from returning unchallenged. That is a narrower achievement than complete repair, and a more durable one than ceremony alone. A complete record still does not make every question answerable. The votes of the first court-martial are known, but the surviving papers cannot measure how much weight each judge placed on the secret packet. Later testimony can describe procedure and recollection. It cannot recreate private deliberation with certainty. Esterhazy's later interviews carry a different limit. He changed his account and at times admitted writing the bordereau while trying to move responsibility elsewhere. Those statements belong in the history as statements by an interested participant. They do not become neutral proof simply because they arrived after the affair was famous. The death of Zola also attracted claims of deliberate interference with the blocked chimney that filled his home with fumes. The documented official conclusion was accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. Suspicion can be reported, but the available record does not justify turning it into a solved murder inside this story. These boundaries strengthen the central finding rather than weaken it. The case does not depend on knowing every private motive, every meeting involving Esterhazy, or every later rumor. It depends on claims the record can support. Dreyfus did not write the bordereau. The defense was denied the secret material used at the first trial. Henry forged a supposed proof, and the Court of Cassation found no surviving basis for the convictions. Historical certainty becomes clearer when settled facts are not mixed with unresolved ones. The final answer can remain firm without pretending the archive contains every answer. The March order remains the decisive hinge. Before it, the secret dossier could be invoked as a reason for confidence. After it, every paper had to answer questions that confidence had postponed. Was the item genuine? Was it present at the original trial? Did it concern Dreyfus? Could the interpretation survive comparison with the bordereau, Esterhazy's hand, and the known forgery? The answers did not arrive all at once. The first review annulled the original judgment, but sent the case back to the military. Rennes convicted again. Pardon released Dreyfus without clearing him. Only the second review brought handwriting, provenance, alleged confessions, and secret intelligence into one legal accounting. That long path explains why the final phrase carried weight. Nothing remained standing. It was not a dramatic substitute for analysis. It was the result of analysis. The bordereau did not point to Dreyfus. The petit bleu pointed toward Esterhazy. The faux Henry pointed back into the intelligence office. The secret dossier showed how hidden material had protected a weak accusation. The file had changed roles. In 1894, it helped condemn a man who could not answer it. In 1906, its separated papers helped show why the condemnation could not stand. Later, the same archive allowed the public to examine the methods, loyalties, and errors that had once been protected by secrecy. No document performed that reversal by itself. Someone had to preserve the scrap, compare the handwriting, carry the information outside a closed office, publish the accusation, inspect the paper seam, order the dossier produced, test the expert method, and refuse to treat pardon as innocence. Dreyfus carried the simplest part of the case through every stage. He had not written the bordereau. He had not transferred the listed secrets to Germany. He wanted the judgment removed for himself, for Lucy, and for the children who lived under his name. The state took 12 years to reach the same answer. It crossed 2 court-martial verdicts, 2 reviews, a forged proof, exile, pardon, and hundreds of pages before the Court of Cassation could say that the accusation had no remaining support. The clearest memorial is therefore not the degradation ceremony, the famous headline, or even the restored medal. It is the file after secrecy lost its power to prevent reply. Its papers can now be separated. Their dates can be checked. Their authors can be named. Their limits can be stated. And once the record became answerable, it could no longer say that Alfred Dreyfus had betrayed France.